Hey guys, what is up? I hope you're all good. Today we're going to talk a little bit about squats, more specifically squat mechanics. Okay, so we're going to be going through a series of videos, maybe around 7 or 8 videos, depending on the feedback that I get from you guys. So if these are too complicated or too simple, we'll scale it back and take our time a little bit more. And if they're too simple and that it's just too easy, then we may pick up the pace a little bit and kind of move through the steps a little bit faster and maybe move on to some more complex concepts. But to start off with, what we're going to be discussing is very basic squat mechanics. Okay, so how to interpret a 2D squat illustration like this, and that will hopefully carry over to a greater understanding and ability to interpret your own squats and the squats of your clients if you're a personal trainer. So, you know, there's going to be a lot of very practical stuff that's going to come from a discussion that might seem quite theoretical, because I think there will be light bulbs going off in your head pretty much immediately as to different things that you have experienced yourself in the gym or seen in the gym, or different I guess a variability in technique that you've seen between your clients or between your friends. And you know, it's quite liberating to understand this stuff, because it kind of allows you to understand that, alright, you know, there actually is a degree of individual variability, and I can't exactly expect myself to always look the same as someone else when I'm exercising, nor can I expect the same of every one of my clients. So hopefully it's going to be in some way helpful. So what you're going to see is a 2D illustration of someone squatting here. Okay, there's a lot of lines added on, and I'm going to explain that. Okay, and the reason that the lines are already on there is because I already recorded this video, but I watched it back and I was like, is just an unnecessary amount of detail and jargon, and I want to keep it a little bit simpler to start off with, because I think back to myself when I didn't understand any of this stuff, and I'm like, yeah, I probably wouldn't have grasped some of the things that I said. So I want to keep it a little bit simpler. So what you've got is this squat illustration very clearly. Okay, so the black lines obviously reflect the body of someone squatting. The red line is a reflection of the position of the barbell. So because the barbell is on that person's back at that point, there's a force coming downward because gravity is accelerating the barbell. Okay, very simple. So we've got that force that's coming straight down, and if that person wasn't there in the way of that bar, then the bar would essentially just accelerate towards the floor. So as a result, we have to resist that with our muscles, and the force is created at each of the joints within the system of the squat. Okay, in orange we're highlighting the center of mass. Okay, so the center of mass is essentially the point at which the mass is centered, very simply. That's a very simple way of understanding it. You don't need to think about it any more than that. Okay, so when we have a barbell on our back, it's going to be somewhere around where the barbell is located. Okay, that might be different if the weight is very, very light. So for example, when you squat with an unloaded barbell on your back, what you're going to find is that it's a little bit more difficult to coordinate the movement. And the reason that is because the bar is quite light relative to your body weight. So the center of mass is not going to be manipulated to the point exactly at which the barbell is. As a result, you're not going to be able to use the exact same technique as comfortably and balance the weight quite as well as you would if the load on the bar was greater than your body weight, because it's technically a different exercise because the load is distributed differently. So, you know, it's just one of those things that might explain something that's been kind of annoying for you, because you might do your warm-up sets, you might put the bar on your back and you might be like, this feels way different to my normal squat, I feel like my technique is off, and then suddenly you put 60 or 80 kilos in the bar and it feels easy. Okay, so that's why that happens. And it's also why when you do a bodyweight squat, it really feels quite awkward, and sometimes it can be quite difficult to balance. And to fully understand that, you need to kind of add in this second concept, which is base of support. So in green I've highlighted the base of support, which is very simply the side profile of your foot in this system. Okay, so in order to stay balanced, you need to keep your center of mass over your base of support. Okay, so base of support, center of mass, and that's essentially where the position of the bar is and the resultant line below that. And to understand this a little bit easier, what you might find is that babies fall over a lot. And granted, that is because they've got poor balance, they've got like poor coordination in general, like they're not able to correct things very well. But a big part of it it's related to balance, but it's the fact that their head is so big, their torso so long, their legs are so small and their feet are so small that they've got, you know, this big wobbly center of mass that is centered way higher and this really small base of support. And as a result, when they lean forward for something, they just kind of keep going. So they've got a higher center of mass than we do, and hence they're more likely to fall over a little bit more. It's beneficial for squatting, which we'll touch on in another video. But to kind of give you guys a bit of a better understanding as to why you might feel less balanced when you're doing a bodyweight squat or a very, very light squat, it's because your center of mass normally resides around your lower abdominal area in around your sacrum. Okay, so very simply just think about your lower abdominal area inside there in your gut somewhere. Okay, so that's kind of where your center of mass lies. So it's lower down than it would be with the barbell on your back, and as a result you need to find some way of getting that center of mass forward, otherwise you're going to fall backward. Okay, because if you were to change this, and I'll rub this out again, but if you were to not have any load on your back and your center of mass was, say, back here, then if you were to approach the squat like this, then you're no longer within your base of support because it isn't over your foot. So what do people do to compensate for that? They put their arms forward, they hold a plate in front of them, they hold a medicine ball, or maybe they even grab a goblet squat like this, and it makes it much easier for them to squat in an upright position. Okay, so they don't need to lean forward as much to shift their center of mass forward. Because that's essentially what people do. Because if you were to hold a weight out in front of you, or hold your arms out, or lean over more, then what that does is move this red line further into essentially the vicinity of where your foot is, so that you can maintain your balance. So we'll rub that out for now. But that probably explains something that you have seen anecdotally. So the big message there is that when you're squatting, you need to be able to keep your center of mass over your base of support, and that's going to be one of the big dictating factors as to why people have such variation in their technique, and why you might feel awkward when you're doing a bodyweight squat or when you're doing a lighter squat with just the barbell on your back. Okay, so when we understand those two concepts, obviously, right, just to scale back a little bit, this is your ankle joint, this is your knee joint, and this is your hip joint, and obviously this is your spine. And what you may not be aware of, or more so that you're not conscious of, is that your spine is not just one big thing at which forces are required to be created. Rather, it's a series of individual joints. So there's intervertebral joints between each vertebra, and as a result there's going to be a specific force demand at each level of the spine, as opposed to it being one big fixed thing. And that's why I've got multiple blue lines here. So the blue line relates to the force demand created at a certain joint. Okay, so you'll see the red line, that's the line of force created by the load that we're using in conjunction with our body weight. And the blue line reflects the distance between that line and the joint in question. So the blue line here to the knee, okay, let's call that X. Okay, so the blue line to the knee is X. That means that we've got X distance between the line of force and the knee joint. Now, let's call the hip moment arm, we'll call that Y, okay? But what you can see is that Y is slightly bigger than 1, okay? So let's say Y equals 1.5X. Sorry, I should have said Y is slightly bigger than X, not 1. So Y is around 1.5 times the size of X. And what that means is that the force demand that is created at the hip joint is going to be 1.5 times greater than that created at the knee joint, okay? With this person's specific technique, and that's really the key, okay? So it is technique specific, it's individual specific, and that is a specific force demand that is created. And in later videos we're going to be showing you how to essentially manipulate that, maybe because you have a knee injury, or maybe because you have a hip injury, or maybe because you feel your squats only in your back. Okay, so that knee-hip relationship is something that people talk about a lot. It's probably more complicated than it seems at face value, and that's something we'll discuss later in further videos. So I guess what you have to realize is that if we were more upright and that red line was further back, then what that would do is essentially increase the size of X, meaning there's a greater force requirement at the knee. If we were to lean forward more, okay, and we were doing, let's say we were doing that bodyweight squat and we weren't putting our hands forward, then the result is is going to be that Y is greater and there's a greater force demand on the hip joint. So, to move on from the knee and the hip, because we're going to be discussing them in a lot of detail in later videos, we've also got the spine, okay? And I've put in multiple blue lines, and the reason for that is because there's a force demand created at each level of the spine as opposed to just the spine as one single unit. So as a result, you're generally going to have the greatest forces created around the lower back than you will at the upper back, okay, very simply, okay? So you've got these force demands created at each level of the spine as well, and they're typically going to be intrinsically linked to the force created at the hip joint, simply because they're all behind the line of force. So the greater the moment arm to the hip joint, generally the greater moment arm to the spine, and that's probably something you've experienced. You'll typically experience, you know, a lot of hip stress and back stress at the same time, with maybe a little bit less going on at the knee joint. And then of course we've got our ankle joint, which isn't that important, but I guess it is still important, especially when some of you might feel that your weight shifts forwards a little bit onto the front of your foot. You might feel a little bit of a greater stretch in your calf, and as a result, and the reason that happens is because this red line shifts forward, your weight's on the front of your foot, and as a result, the distance between the line of force and your actual ankle joint, which is at the back, is greater, and as a result there's a greater force demand. And similarly, it's one of the reasons that if you're more so back in your heels, so the red line is over your heel, you probably don't feel much going on at your calf at all. You probably feel like, oh god, there's not even enough here to keep my foot stable. So yeah, that sort of takes you through the forces. As you can probably tell, it might be difficult to get your head around this right away, because you probably have questions. You're probably like, does this mean that the greater X is, the more the quads are going to work? Does it mean that the greater Y is, the more my glutes or hamstrings or adductors are going to work? And to a degree, yes, but it is a bit more complicated, and that's why I'm not getting too much into muscles in this video, because we need to discuss it in another video to really tease it out, because I've seen a lot of people get really confused by this topic, and I don't want that to happen to you, essentially. So hopefully that makes a little bit of a sense. It's an introduction point. If you even understand the basic concept of having your center of mass over your base of support, you're going to be in a really excellent place. Because honestly, the amount of times I've seen someone, like a personal trainer, not in a bad way, but with good intentions, you know, they assess someone's body weight squat and then they conclude that, oh god, you can't squat, like it's just not for you. It's like, it's a totally different exercise to a loaded squat, okay? And it's why you will see so many people do a goblet squat and suddenly be able to squat magically, and it's not because we did anything fancy, it's very simply because we used physics to manipulate center of mass over a base of support, okay? So plenty more to come on this, guys, so stay tuned, and hopefully that video gave you a little bit of an insight, a bit of an introduction into some of the mechanics of the squat.